Welcome back to the channel, everybody. And after a week filled with crazy special operator drama, we're going to talk about crazy things going on in the world. And in particular, the Ukraine war and the North Korean military involvement there. All right, there's been a lot of insane reporting coming out of the front lines of Ukraine that the North Korean military is being absolutely slaughtered. They're all defecting. They're all deserting. All right, we're going to talk about, is that reporting actually accurate? Okay, not saying that it's not, but we need to do a little investigation into that. Okay, before we get started, just want to say thank you to all the support for the channel. We have obviously a ton of new viewers, new subscribers over the last week, and we're getting back to the actual type of content that we do. But I do want to say thank you. You know, the last 3 videos, as much as people want to say how negative they are, at worst have a 94% like to 6% dislike ratio. And what that tells me is that not just the veteran community, but civilians have integrity still. And I appreciate that as a special operator. Okay, so for those of you who didn't know and why this is such a big deal at what we've been doing, the first RSOF value is integrity. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. But let's jump into this video and talk about it, because it's actually kind of wild. The reporting is pretty crazy. So we're going to talk about, like, are the North Koreans really being slaughtered? Okay, and before we get into this, I really want to preface this with, when it comes to war reporting, okay, reporting coming out of war zones, you guys have to understand, like, take everything with a grain of salt, because it's coming from governments, and governments engage in psychological warfare and psychological warfare-esque reporting. We do it ourselves, right? Al Jazeera does it. Like, everybody's doing it, okay? So always take any reporting about death numbers, casualty numbers, all those things with a huge grain of salt. Just saying that before we get started, okay? Now, we're also going to talk about, which I think is very interesting, is Ukraine's actual PSYOP program that they're running, called the I Want to Live program. We're going to jump into that because I think that's really interesting. Designed to basically try to get North Koreans to desert and defect. And we'll say if, we're going to talk about if it's currently being successful and what's the likelihood of it actually having, like, large scale effects, right? Then we're going to talk about, at the very end, what the long-term effects of hundreds of thousands of North Korean troops being in Europe and exposed to the regular world is going to look like when they all go back to North Korea. I think that's an interesting topic. Now, let's talk about first the North Korean military, okay? Because this is very, very important, I think, to understand when we talk about, like, likelihood of them being slaughtered on the front lines. Because, again, reporting's really difficult to take and think about, like, accurately. So the biggest thing we got to understand about the North Korean military is, and obviously take this with a grain of salt too, because nobody really knows a whole lot about the North Korean military based off of the secrecy, obviously, the way they live. But what we do know is their primary training, right, what they spend the vast majority of their time doing as a military, is working on being good at parades, marching, which they are insanely good at, right? You put them in a DNC, a drill competition, these guys will crush it. And propaganda films. Okay, so they're not investing all their time in actual training for war fighting and things like this. It's just not what they do. Okay, I'm sure they do a little bit of it here and there, but we can tell, like, you're not that good at parades and marching if you don't spend an obscene amount of time at it. All right. Also, they have no combat experience, and they are entering a conflict in in Ukraine and Russia, with 2 first world nations that have been at war for 2 years. You are a military with no exposure to the real world, no exposure to real war technology, no combat experience, no real military experience and training, and being dropped in on the front lines of that conflict, fighting Ukraine, who is supplied by the United States military, trained by the United States military. Yeah, not a position I'd want to be in, right? Also, you know, you hear a lot about their malnourishment. So reporting what I've heard, and again, conjecture, is you have sort of the North Korean, let's say, special operations units that actually do get well fed, they do get well trained, things like that. but the majority of the military is extremely malnourished, undertrained, under-equipped, all those sorts of things, which would kind of make sense, right? Also, the North Korean military is not going to gain any respect from the Russian troops. Okay, again, Russian troops have been fighting this war for 2 years, and a bunch of random North Koreans show up on the front line. It's very likely that Russia is just going to use them as frontline cannon fodder. Okay, so that's kind of the reality of the North Korean military and what it looks like of them entering the front line. So not a great start if we want to talk about are they being slaughtered or not. The other big thing is sort of where this fight's going on, right? Which is right on the border, primarily on the front lines of, if I might say it wrong, Kursk Oblast, I believe, and Belgorod. Yeah, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Obviously, not my primary language, but it's right on the border, obviously. You can put it up on the map of Ukraine, Russia, and the conflict. So it is the hot zone. It's also the zone, as we've seen, that's in, and I put this up in a different video, so you guys saw the picture in the editing, that's in the range of all the American HIMARS and ATACMS missile range. Okay, that is not good for anyone on the front lines, especially North Koreans who have no prior exposure to this type of warfare. So we do know is that Ukraine has been using a ton of ATACMS strikes, HIMARS strikes, and hitting North Korean outposts and things like that. Now, North Korean reporting is announced, they just the other day that they hit a North Korean camp and killed over 50 people and injured a North Korean general and all these things. Again, the problem with that type of reporting is when you send a HIMARS missile 150 miles and strike a target, the ability for you to do a BDA, which is called a battle damage assessment, which we do on the ground when we're in combat to figure out how many people were actually killed, things like that, is almost impossible. Okay, so there's really no way Ukraine actually knows the effectiveness of what's going on. It's mainly conjecture. Okay, and American military, we do it as well, as we sort of estimate the amount of damage that's been done. Okay, so it's not necessarily doing out of the Ukraine's doing it to lie about the war, but yeah, that's where I said you got to take this reporting with a grain of salt. Ukraine's also using a ton of drone and kamikaze drone strikes right there on the border in this trench warfare style fighting, which I can tell you, if you're North Korea and you're coming from, if you're a North Korean soldier and you're coming from North Korea and have no exposure to any of this technology, and all of a sudden there's kamikaze drones flying, exploding, and killing people around you, I can't imagine the sheer amount of terror that would instill in somebody who, again, has no exposure to this type of fighting. Okay, and then general combat. General combat, it's obviously ugly in the type that it's happening. Drone warfare, trench warfare, tank warfare. We do know, again, at bare minimum, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed already. Okay, Russia and Ukraine. And yeah, so the final sort of conjecture we're making here is it a slaughter? Yeah, it probably is. Again, North Koreans are being shoved on the front lines and fighting the Ukrainian military that's trained by American Special Forces, equipped by the U.S. government, and has been fighting with 2 years combat experience. Yeah, they're going to get absolutely slaughtered. There's no doubt in my mind about that one. Now, but are they actually deserting en masse because of it? Because that's what the reporting is suggesting, and we need to talk about that. So the next thing we need to talk about is Ukraine's big PSYOP program that, again, they're calling the I Want to Live program. The idea behind this program, okay, is the assumption that North Koreans don't want to fight on behalf of North Korea. They don't want to be in this conflict, and we can get them to defect and desert on the front lines. Okay, so the way they're doing this is a bunch of different ways. Some of the big ways they're using it is they've done, which is pretty smart, they've done a bunch of videos, right, showing the Ukrainian prisoner of war camps and how nice they are, and there's nice soft beds, and there's gardens and flowers, and you get nice hot meals, and like all these things that would, to a North Korean soldier, you would think would be highly motivational to get them to desert. All right, they're also, and South Korea actually uses this on the DMZ and has for a long time, but supposedly they're also using loudspeakers. Okay, so they're getting South Koreans to basically do voice messages, playing over loudspeakers to try to get North Koreans to come across, telling them, like, the supreme leader doesn't care about you, he sent you to the front lines to die, all of these sorts of things. Your typical PSYOP type of rhetoric, okay? And then drone leafleting, which basically dropping pamphlets en masse out of drones into North Korean areas. They pick them up, they rewriting, same type of stuff that we just talked about, okay? That's pretty normal. We actually used that same type of leafleting process out of aircraft and stuff in Afghanistan and Iraq to the civilian populace, tried to use psychological operations, talk about how the Taliban is bad and they're, you know, the ones that are actually causing you so much distress, all these types of things. So typical psychological operations, right? And then final thing is radio, okay? So even if you have encrypted, I don't want to get too deep into radios because it's complex, but in militaries, typically radios are encrypted, which means if you don't have a cryptographic key that matches the other radio, you wouldn't be able to get them to talk over it. But what you can do, as long as you can get on the frequency and find the frequency, which you can do through RFDF process, again, I don't want to get into it too much, but you can figure out what frequencies people are transmitting on, and you can actually transmit over their radio, okay? You can't hear what they're saying, but they can hear what you're saying, okay, through a plain text means. I know that's probably confusing, but the idea is they're transmitting these messages over radios that the North Koreans are potentially using, okay? So that's sort of this big desertion motivating program that the Ukrainians are trying. Now, the question is it working and will it work, okay? And the big piece that I think the majority of reporting and the majority of people are missing here, because I don't think it's going to work. On the surface, it seems like it would work great, right? These poor North Korean soldiers sent to the front lines to die. They're malnourished. They're from North Korea. All they got to do is walk across the border and live a great life. The problem is everyone knows the way the Kim family has held power, and that is through absolute violence and fear-mongering tactics, okay? So what they're really known for is, and this has come from North Korean deserters, not me, is basically slaughtering your entire family and bloodline if you do something against the government. So you can be 100% sure that any North Korean soldier that defects or deserts the front lines, and that goes back to North Korea, and these soldiers know that your entire bloodline is going to be executed if you desert. Your mom, your dad, your brothers, your sisters, your kids, your wife. Now, that is, I mean, it's dark to think about, right? But that is a huge no-no for most people. You can think about yourself, right? Are you willing to try to survive if it means you'd have to have your entire family and bloodline slaughtered? Your wife, your kids, your mom, your dad, your brothers, your sisters? You know, me, I'm like, I'm never deserting in that case. And that's going to stop, I think, a huge amount of any mass desertion type tactics. I don't think we're going to see it. But I think there will be onesies and twosies here and there, just because it is what it is, right? But again, large scale, I don't see it happening. So let's talk about the potential long-term effects in North Korea, let's say post-war, because I think this is a super interesting topic because North Korea, being so isolationist, they have no access to internet. From what I've heard, you know, they might have smartphones, but they're basically like child locked by the government. The government can monitor everything you're doing, right? So no real access to outside information. Excuse me. No real outside access to the rest of the world. Have now basically moved into Europe, right? Yes, in the Russian side, okay, but they're in basically a Russian region where there's modern technology. The Russian soldiers next to them have cell phones hooked up to the internet, right? From rumors are that North Koreans are sort of obsessed with pornography now, right? Because they've got access to the internet now and they can look up these things. Now, you know, that sounds kind of silly to talk about, but my point is that hundreds of thousands of young military-age males have come from this massive brainwash, isolationist environment and have just been exposed to the real world. After the war, sending hundreds of thousands of military-age males back to that environment could have massive consequences for the Kim regime, potentially. So the Kim regime is going to have to, and I'm sure they're thinking about that, going to have to figure out how to handle that process. And what I think is, if the majority of them aren't just killed on the front lines of the Ukraine conflict, but let's say this conflict ends in 2 months when Donald Trump takes office and brokers a peace deal, and they all go back. I think they're probably going to kill most of them. I know that's dark to talk about, but I just don't see the Kim regime allowing an entire generation of young men exposed to the real world war fighters, if you can call them that, back into their society. I think it's way too problematic. So there could be some really dark outcomes from that. But we'll have to see. Like, again, I don't know. It could have, or it could completely reshape the Kim regime, where they have to sort of start to loosen things up and sort of have to let exposure come to the outside world. But I'm not sure. It's such a complicated sort of theory craft to do, right? And I mean, I'm not going to be able to do it any better than the next smartest person, right? But I do think like this is an interesting topic in general, and you know, again, I don't know how much longer this war is going to go on, but it should be sort of interesting to see how these things take shape and unfold, right? So that is going to do it for this one. All right, I am looking at doing some new type of content on the channel, right? Based off of what we've seen from things recently. 2024, you kind of being the year of truth, a lot of exposure, a lot of people being exposed. Thinking about starting a sort of real war heroes podcast where I bring on guys that I know through either actual, Valor Award citation stories, guys I worked with and watched do things. Because I know that a lot of the populace, a lot don't care about the drama going on, but I know a lot of the populace does not appreciate that they've sort of been lied to about their war fighters for the last 10 years, the prominent ones. So what I want to do is bring on and tell the stories of guys who did real heroic shit. That way, the American public can start getting, because trust me, it's for all the fake bullshit that's out there, there's 10 times more real heroic stuff that had happened. Okay, so gonna have on Medal of Honor winners, Silver Star winners, and not just special operators, infantrymen. Should be, I think, a cool podcast that we could do going forward. So I'm gonna start working on that, reaching out to guests, and we'll see what happens with that. Anyway, also just again, appreciate the support, guys. So many people have reached out thanking me for what's been going on the channel. Again, we're back to what we do. Happy to be here, but again, thank you very much, and I'll catch y'all. Oh, one more thing. So what I'm gonna do too, and I'm working on this episode probably for next week. This Sunday we are doing I'm releasing a Air Force Special Warfare versus Army Special Warfare episode. I know a ton of people ask me about the Air Force soft side of things. That's the one I know least about. So, I've got a really prominent Air Force PJ to come on, and we're going to talk back and forth. So that episode's coming Sunday. Should be super interesting if you're into that. And then also, I'm going to work on, and this is going to be just for like the long-term fans of the channel, guys and gals who are really invested sort of in me at this point. I'm going to do, and it's going to be super long form, sort of a My Special Forces career episode where I walk through the start to the finish, all the ups, all the downs, all the successes, all the failures, go through all my awards, combat stories, talk about schools, things I did wrong, things I did right, so that you guys who are fans of the channel sort of have a biography of me. And I'll provide the paperwork to go with it. All right. So look out for that. Again, appreciate you guys. Love you guys. Take care.